Good evening and welcome. It's so great to see such a full house here tonight. I'm absolutely delighted to have you here. Tonight is not only the annual meeting of the Friends of Forbes Library, but it is also an event in our Big Read series. The Big Read is a couple months long. It's organized by a local committee called All Hamptons Read, which is comprised of the communities of Northampton, Florence, Easthampton, Southampton, and Westhampton, and we've come together to offer book discussions and community events inspired by the Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett. The program is supported by the National Endowment for the Arts, along with Arts Midwest, Florence Bank, Easthampton Savings Bank, and the friends groups of each participating library, including our own fabulous Friends of Forbes. The Maltese Falcon was published in 1930, and the story takes place in 1928. There were 3 film adaptations, including the most notable, directed by John Huston, starring Humphrey Bogart and Mary Astor. They came out in 1941 and featured period costume and setting. The book itself is written very stylistically and comes across as a real period piece. It is impossible to read it and not think about the time the book is set. Across the country, here in Northampton, Calvin Coolidge was finishing up his term as the 30th President of the United States and returning to live out the remainder of his years here in Northampton. But what else was going on? How did it compare to the city we know now? 3 members of our information services staff are here tonight to paint this picture for us, utilizing historical records and research sources from our archives. We will begin with 2 members of our information services staff, Elise Bernier-Feeley and Julie Bartlett-Nelson. And I'm going to introduce them both, and then they will trade off. Elise Bernier-Feeley is the local history librarian here at Forbes Library. She is an expert genealogist, as well as being a fountain of knowledge on the people, places, and events that make up our community's past. She has recently been appointed to the Southampton Historical Commission, and as many of you know, is a wonderful storyteller, and she uses her wit and knowledge to bring history to life. Julie Bartlett-Nelson is the archivist at the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Library Museum, this very room we are in tonight, as well as for the Hampshire Room for Local History, also here at Forbes Library. She is on the board of the Pioneer Valley History Network and has served on the board of the Digital Commonwealth, which is a statewide collaborative of libraries, museums, and other like-minded organizations working to get history up on the internet through digital access to collections. Julie is a history buff, that's probably no surprise here, with a special interest in historical cookbooks. Julie is a regular guest speaker at historical societies, retirement communities, and conferences, and last year appeared on the CNN First Ladies television series speaking about Grace Coolidge. So I will now welcome Julie and Elise up to the front.
Good evening. So it's not often I get to talk about Calvin in his own museum. So I don't have quite as many pictures as Elise will have because we have an entire room full of visual aids for us, as well as objects, artifacts, and photos. So I'm going to take you on a little tour of some national highlights of the 1920s, and then more specific what Grace and Calvin Coolidge were up to during the 20s. So we most often think of the Roaring 20s. So what was going on? 1920, U.S. population was 106 million. It had increased by 16% in 1930 up to 123 million. In Massachusetts, 1920 census, we're at 3.8 million. And here in Northampton, we're at 21,000. So we haven't grown that much since 1920. For the U.S., 13% were first-generation immigrants, and 51% lived in towns of more than 2,500 people. So we have more than half the population living in major cities. For 1920 and 1921, we do have a recession for farming. So farm prices and produce and goods had taken a major decline. By 1925, we're more stable and things are back up to sort of the 19-teens levels. So what did things cost for 1925? A pound of bacon was 47 cents. A pound of bread was 10 cents. A pound of butter, 55 cents. And that fluctuated a lot during the 1920s. Butter was one of the biggest changes for supply and demand. A pound of coffee was 50 cents. A dozen eggs were 55 cents. 5 pounds of flour, 31 cents. And a half a gallon of milk was 28 cents. Where was the liquor? Prohibition. So 1920 to 1933, we have a dry country. We also had a dry White House with no partying. Although for Prohibition, you think of the 20s as speakeasies and bootlegging. In 1926, it was a $3.5 billion a year illegal trade for liquor. Single-family house prices averaged $3,500 to $5,000. So how do people afford all these things? The salaries, manufacturing was about $1,200 per year, but strikes and layoffs were quite common. So it was kind of an unstable industry. And the majority of Northampton, as you'll learn a little bit later, had a lot of manufacturing. Farming prices fluctuated a lot in the 1920s, but most farmers were making about $600 a year. And they're also growing their own food, so their food prices are minimal, or they're bartering. Office workers, the males are making about $1,200 a year, and females about $800. Teachers were $800 to $1,000 a year for 9 months of work. At the college level, however, they were about $1,200 to $1,800 for junior positions, and senior, tenured, and dean levels were could be up to $3,500 a year. Skilled trades were about $1 per hour, and again, lots of strikes, lots of layoffs happening throughout the 20s. Store clerks were about 15 cents per hour, and bank tellers were about 20 cents per hour. By 1925, 40% of people were earning over $2,000. But still by 1929, we have only 70% of people with incomes below $3,000. So we haven't grown that much in the decade. And my favorite 20s quote, 1929, Anna Richardson of the American Home Economics Association observed, "Homemaking still ranks first as the occupation employing the largest numbers of persons expending the longest hours of labor." So 1920s saw an explosion in consumer goods and electric household appliances such as your vacuums, toasters, waffle irons, popcorn makers, washing machines, sewing machines, the radio, and electric refrigerators. The installment system and buying on credit had gained popularity in the 20s, although Calvin Coolidge himself never bought on credit. He never bought anything he couldn't pay cash for. Although his wife did have a McCallum's department store charge card, it was always paid in full at the end of the week. And he was not always happy with the bill. A vacuum cleaner in 1920 cost $40. You could buy it for $2 down and $4 a month. So when you think how little money you were making, $40 vacuum was quite expensive. General Mills created the Betty Crocker persona in 1921, and we saw an increase in cereals, canned goods, packaged foods. So for the first time, your grocery, you were seeing a lot of new products for sale. The Sears catalog was quite popular in the 20s. 1926, over 15 million catalogs were distributed. We don't quite have the houses in the Sears catalog yet. Those are still coming along. Communication in the 20s. 1920 saw the first transcontinental airmail service. So we're getting much faster mail service, international mail as well. 1920, the Radio Corporation of America and the KDKA broadcast regularly from Pittsburgh. So you are now having talk shows and radio talk shows as well as music in your living room. 1924, we had 2.5 billion radios in homes, and in 1920, we'd only had 2,000. By 1929, radio sales had hit $852 million. 1927, Coolidge signed the first law regulating radio broadcasting. So when we think of the FCC, think of Calvin starting those first laws. Other communications, the telephone. 1921, only 13% of homes had a telephone, and they were your party line systems. For transportation, we have cars by the 1920s. Ford is making 1 million cars per year, selling in over 10,000 dealerships across the U.S. 1925, the Model T was down to only $260. 1909, it had been $950. So thanks to the assembly line and Ford's assembly system, we're seeing a dramatic drop in car prices. So by 1926, 1 in 6 Americans owned an automobile. And by 1929, we have 23 million autos in the US on the roads. So what's Calvin up to in the 1920s? So we have 1920, our lovely scene here. Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge is nominated for the vice presidency. July 27, 1920 is the official notification to Coolidge and his nomination with a parade and acceptance speech here in Northampton. So we have about 10,000 people in Northampton for this parade and speech, which was on Allen Field. If we go to the next photo, this is the Coolidge family on the front steps of their Massasoit Street house when the official notification took place. So we have their son John, Grace, Calvin, and their younger son Calvin Jr. And so that was one of their propaganda photos during the campaign of the happy family on the steps. August 18, 1920 is the 19th Amendment passing, giving women the right to vote. November 2nd, 1920, Grace Coolidge cast her first federal election ballot with her husband on it as vice president. So we have this photo was actually staged for the media. This is outside City Hall. So technically that's not their real ballots, but staged for the cameras. And actually thanks to Chris Nolan, is she here? She's the one who gave me all the names of who the people are in the photo. So by summer 1923, we have Calvin and Grace Coolidge vacationing at his father's farm in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. President Harding was vacationing in San Francisco and fell ill and passed away there. So at 2:47 a.m. on August 3rd, 1923, Coolidge becomes the president. He is sworn in by his father by candlelight in his father's living room. And we actually have a painting up there. Probably can't see from your seats because I turned the lights off. So there is a painting recreation of that. There are no photos of that actual ceremony. Coolidge is ushered to Washington by train. He's sworn in again by a federal official. His father was a state official, so he did get sworn in again. So anytime you're on Jeopardy and that trivia question comes up of who's sworn in twice, he's one of them. We do have his two sons. So John is at an Army training camp at Camp Devens, and the younger son, Calvin Jr., is working at a tobacco farm in Hadley. So they are scooped up by the Secret Service and taken to Washington for their father to assume the presidency. And, oh, no, sorry, go back. August 6, 1923, we have Coolidge gave his first radio address as president. And we'll learn a little bit more about the radio in a minute. 1924, he's running for his own term. July 7th, 1924, we have Calvin Coolidge Jr. died at the age of 16 of blood poisoning. He had developed a blister on his foot playing tennis in the White House lawns, and it had become infected. And this is the last photo we have of Calvin Jr., and this is the day he played the tennis match. So the boys in the back, Calvin Jr. is on the left, and John is on the right. We do have, we have a generation of people in Northampton here who only wore white socks after this. We had a generation of mothers who thought that the black dye in the black socks he was wearing contributed to the blood poisoning. It did not, but that's also why you see professional tennis players wearing white socks and only cotton socks. Next photo. So after that summer, we have Charles Dawes, who's the vice presidential nominee, and the president's father did the majority of the campaigning for 1924. And here we have the president's father is sending off a truck for the campaign from Plymouth Notch, Vermont, his home, to go on the Lincoln Highway. And so this is going to be an all-American tour for Coolidge and Dawes. Highways in the 1920s. We have, by 1921, 387,000 miles of surfaced roads. And this had exploded from the previous decade of only 190,000. And we'll continue to get more and more roads throughout the 30s and 40s. The radio. So despite what you may think FDR is the radio president with the fireside chats, it's Calvin Coolidge that's the first president to really utilize the radio as new technology. The 1925 inauguration is the first one broadcast nationally, so that everyone in their living rooms could hear the president speak and could hear the inaugural address. They did several test speeches in the months preceding that. And we have here, this is actually not the inauguration, this is one of his test speeches. But you do have the NBC radio microphone there. As well as the radio, we also have sound and motion picture coming into play for Coolidge in the 20s. Audiences see the first motion picture with sound, The Jazz Singer, in 1927. And then Calvin Coolidge gives a speech on the White House lawn in 1927 that is recorded with sound and picture. And that is also recorded and broadcast. We have Kodak introduces the color motion picture by 1929. So not only do we have silent pictures, we have partial talkies, and we're starting to get color by the end of the decade. Aviation is the other love for Calvin Coolidge. He's fascinated with air travel, although he doesn't live to ever go on a plane himself. And this is him giving Charles Lindbergh a medal. So Lindbergh had landed the Spirit of St. Louis in Paris on May 21st, 1927, with the first transatlantic flight. For 1927, we also have Calvin Coolidge summering in Black Hills, South Dakota. And you'll see in the room lots of items from that summer travels. In the back of the room is a Sioux headdress. And that was presented to Coolidge. He visited many reservations that summer, and he had signed the act giving those on reservations full citizenship. For him, he did have Native American blood, but for him it was an economic thing. He wanted those who lived on reservations that were veterans to earn their full pensions. And prior to that, everyone was pushing for assimilation, so he had backed off on that and was allowing reservations again. We don't get till Hoover full voting rights, so that comes into play, but Coolidge had started that, it just didn't pass under him. The automobile in Coolidge. So Coolidge never drives a car himself. He will come to own many cars. Ford Motor Company celebrated its 15 million Model T off the assembly line in 1927. And Ford also took over the Lincoln limousine line. So this was Coolidge's presidential Lincoln limo. He purchases it from the government when he left office, and he hired a chauffeur to drive him in it. A local man, John Bukowski, who would later serve as Grace's chauffeur and act as her escort and bodyguard. And by her, he became the agent to buy her many vehicles over the years. And at one time lived at her Road Forks house as her guard. So this is Bukowski with the Lincoln limo in front of the Massasoit Street house, and this is 1929, right when they came back from the White House. So we have March 4th, 29 is the Hoover inauguration, and the Coolidges quietly return here home to Northampton. They do return to their rented half a duplex at 21 Massasoit Street. They will buy their first home, the Beaches, on Hampton Terrace in 1930. Prior to that, Coolidge doesn't own a home. He says in his autobiography that it's because his job is tied to an election, and if he loses an election, he'd lose his job. And again, he never bought anything on credit. So he didn't want a mortgage he couldn't afford, and after his White House years, they paid cash for the beaches. It's named that for beech trees, and they are the third owner of that property, so it was not new for them. October 29th, 1929, we see Black Tuesday and the stock market collapse. We'll also see when Grace sells the beaches, she sold it for a quarter of what she paid for it, due to the economy. Next. So January 5th, 1933, Calvin Coolidge died at his home. You'll see on the side wall there is a whole panel, a little bit more about his death and funeral. The funeral was here in Northampton, and this is the scene outside Edwards Church. So this is the old Edwards Church, for those of you that do remember it. And this is the crowd gathered outside of the church. Grace remained in the beaches until 1937. She sold it to her neighbor and began construction on her new home on Ward Avenue that she referred to as Road Forks. So if you're driving down Ward Ave where the road bends, that's where her house is. She lived there till her death in '57. And Road Forks, in the construction of it, was very widely written up in the newspaper. She had the first non-white plumbing fixture in Northampton. She wanted beige, porcelain, and marble. She did not want white. It was special permit by the plumbing inspectors and also by the state. So you can thank her for anything non-white in your bathroom today, in here in Northampton. So I invite you to browse around the museum at the conclusion of the program, and certainly ask plenty of questions, but you've got the whole museum to tour, as well as this. So I've given you a little bit of some generic information about the 1920s, and so now I'm going to turn it over to Elise, who's going to give you a much more up-close and personal tour and details of what was going on here at Northampton.
I am the comic relief. Northampton in the 1920s. There's so much about Northampton in the 1920s that you can't get it all in. I tried. My printer didn't do very well with it, I'll tell you. Following the Great War, World War I, Northampton was a city in transition. The war had taken some of the best and the brightest of her young men, and the city was changing both economically and socially. The following is a timeline of the 1920s in Northampton. It's a little bit out of sync, by the way. With little interesting vignettes, which I feel give insight into Northampton trends and her changing historical face. I want to start with the Academy of Music. In the 1920s, the Academy of Music endured major budget deficits, as well as stock and repertory companies who came and went as if the theater had a revolving front door. Several times the management was bailed out of debt through anonymous gifts or the kindness of Frank Lyman, for example, the son of E.H.R. Lyman, who had built and given the Academy to the citizens of Northampton in 1892, establishing the first municipal theater in America. In the 1920s, the Academy not only had debt problems, it had musicians' union strikes, moving picture showings that produced little in the line of profits, and a constant barrage of letters pro and con to the Gazette as to whether it should give up the ghost and close completely. In 1926, the mayor and city council hotly discussed whether or not the city should pay the deficits incurred by meager profits, failed companies, and come-and-go managers. By 1929-30, the city made major repairs to the theater, about $20,000 worth, with the proviso that its coffers be reimbursed through ticket sales profits. They weren't making that much profit, so I don't know why the city thought that was so. The theater never seemed to be self-sustaining, but somehow it made it through the decade, and it's still part of the cultural heartbeat of Northampton. In fact, tonight, it's young at heart. Oh, bad joke. Yeah. I was wondering if I should put that in or not. The big news in banking in Northampton was the First National Bank at the corner of King and Main. Its first building was built in 1866, but it would be 60 years before the First National would plan a new building. And if I can get this. That new building was planned December the 14th, 1926, and it moves forward on erecting the new building between May and November of 1927 when it buys the land. And then the new building illustration came in the Gazette in 1928, and they decided to add a new vault in 1928 also, and it opened May the 17th through 19th, 1928. And it's very famous for its Art Deco ceiling. If you go into Silverscape Designs and you look up, you see the most beautiful Art Deco. I love that building. It's absolutely wonderful. Florence Savings Bank, 50th anniversary, 1923. And it's the first bank to have a woman official as of January 18th, 1926. Good for you, Florence Savings Bank. Northampton Institution for Savings, the old building was torn down in 1914. The new building opened in 1915, and that beautiful building is still here. And its assets were over $9 million in 1921. That was a lot of money in those days. You know, the banks were in pretty good shape. City Hall controversy. This is a biggie. The committee favors building a new city hall in Main Street Park in 1923. There is much reaction in the Gazette. Letters keep pouring in. I think the editor probably stayed up till 3 o'clock in the morning just thinking about the letters that poured in. Main Street Park plan was voted down by the City Council March 16th of 1923, but it was brought up again. There were 400 voters that petitioned against the new building in 1923. And then there was a citizens' mass meeting which favors repair on the present building. That was a William Fenno Pratt building, by the way, which was built in 1850. I love it. It looks, I mean, it's one of my favorites. I know other people don't like it, but I do. It's so Gothic-y, isn't it? It's wonderful. So the council votes to spend $25,000 from the Smith's Ferry Fund. Now, you have to understand that we sold Smith's Ferry to Holyoke. That's, you know, in this time period. So they think to themselves, we're going to dip into the Smith's Ferry Fund. Then the plans for remodeling get adopted in July of 1923, but the city council almost votes down appropriations. They disapprove of the contract, but they pass it anyway. And there's a new lease on life for the old building as of 1924. Now the airplane craze in Northampton. There was a pilot named Bert Acosta who was pretty well known all over the United States. And he came to the Mount Tom Airport in October of 1921. You know, you have to understand that airplanes became really important in World War I. But most people in 1910 didn't even understand about them. So this is 1921, it's pretty early. Probably the greatest endurance pilot of his time. And of him it was said, he could have flown a barn door if it had wings. I love that. He was colorful, he was a lover of pretty women. He was a Curtiss test pilot, and he won the 1921 Pulitzer race at 197.8 miles per hour. In 1927, he did an endurance record of 51 hours, 11 minutes, and 25 seconds. Eat your heart out, Lindbergh, for that time period anyway. Now, the first major international air meet took place in 1910. But here in Northampton in 1929, Frank Lyman, again son of E.H.R. Lyman, who gave the Academy of Music to the citizens of Northampton, gives $1,000 to fund an air meet in 1929. There was an air parade that opened before, you know, with floats and all that sort of thing, and kids going around with their bikes. And Marine flyers came to the meet. And they had an aerial sham battle planned in 1929 as well, in June. And the meet took place July 5th of 1929. It was a great success. Maybe the Academy should have had airplanes, you know. Also, airships were really big. Dirigibles were big. And there was one here on November 20th, 1923, called the Shenandoah. And the Shenandoah was filled with helium, not with hydrogen, okay? And its construction was debated, kind of hotly debated, but the first flight was September 4th, 1923, and Northampton had it November 20th, 1923. So as it went over New York, it then thought of Northampton. I'm cutting a lot of this because I can see that, you know, you do want to go home, don't you, at some point? The worst thing that happened, actually, and this is sad, is that in 1925, the Shenandoah splits apart because of an error. You know, these were very light ships, and 14 of its crew were killed instantly, including the pilot. Another one that came in November 24th, 1931, and I'm not supposed to talk about 31, but I'm going to, was the Akron. Very similar, never had any kind of accident. There was an astronomic phenomenon. Now, my father told me about this one. There was a total eclipse of the sun on January the 24th, 1925, here in Northampton. And my father said, I looked at it. I shouldn't have looked at it. Nobody knew anything about looking at an eclipse. So everybody was there looking at the sun, and, you know, you can burn your cornea out, but nobody knew about that then. Automobiles. The city had 50 in 1915, and it grew to about 100 in 1920. I love that. The first rental car establishment, 1926. The Mass Registry, 1931. The next time you go, just tell them that. You've been here since 1931. You must be good to me. There was a big exposition called the Made in Northampton Exposition in 1927. They called us the bright spot of New England. And on February 21st, 22nd, 23rd of 1927, we had our celebration. And we had it at Memorial Hall. On the top part of Memorial Hall were the public schools and all the exhibits by the kids and all that sort of thing. On the bottom part were all of the great industries of Northampton. You know, they thought, let's give Northampton its due. There's so many incredible industries, silk industries, cutlery industries, and they were all there. Must have been quite a thing. It was the 100th anniversary in 1925 of Lafayette's visit to Northampton. And it was the 100-year centennial. And the DAR planted trees all over Northampton to commemorate it. Bless their hearts. I don't know where these trees are. It didn't say it in the Gazette, but I thought that was pretty neat. He planted himself, by the way, at what later became the Draper Hotel, what is now Faces, you know. But it wasn't known as the Draper then. It was known, I think, as the Vinton House when he was here in 1825. And he presented a cane, a commemorative cane. This was always done, I guess, when you came somewhere, to Isaac Damon, the great architect of Northampton. City government. Mrs. Bessie F. Dewey was elected to the Board of Aldermen in 1927. She was, now, I know this is a crowd that votes Democratic. She was a Republican. Board of Public Works, the city council favors a board in 1920. We didn't have one until then. They had to have a hearing at Boston. City engineer and superintendents of street were combined in 1922. That was criticized by the mayor in 1924. And they exceeded their budget of $10,000 in 1928. Bridge Street Cemetery was expanding at the time. There was supposed to be an extension, and it was roundly made the neighbors very, very upset. And so it went on and on. From 1922 to about 1929, this extension was deferred. And it wasn't settled by the city until 1934, but the city prevailed on its extension. So if you want to get buried there, it's okay. It's all extended. City government establishes an ordinance by outlining city salaries in 1925. They'd never done it since 1883 when it became a city. And they increased the mayor's salary for the absolute first time in 1927. They had a go-round about the city charter, which I'm not going to go into. Factories. What happened with factories was kind of a precursor to what happened in the 1930s when everything started to unglue here in Northampton. In 1920, Bay State was a great cutlery center. Belding Brothers was going strong, but what happens? The weavers strike in July of 1921, and the strikers become violent. There's violence right at the plant. The strike is settled in July of 21, but the workers then demand a raise in April of 1923. The increase is granted, but then the loom workers, who were not included, strike again in 1924. They hold out for their demand. The mayor addresses the strikers to no avail. The mill reopens with picketing going on in July of 1924, and then they buy the Hemingway Steel Company still in 1926. But this is really something that is, I think, endemic of the 1920s in most towns. You had strikes beginning. You had unions and strikes. Corticelli Silk Company, the Nonotuck Silk Company, changes its name to Corticelli Silk in November of 1921, and then immediately there's a strike at Leeds. They increase the rates on spun silk to offset that, but the strikers then return to the mill, and then the union demands 15% increase in May of 1921. And they strike again, and they strike again, and they reject the company offer in June of 1921, and they continue to strike into July of 21, and then the company sells the Leeds mill to Champlain Silk in 1930, and Champlain Silk decides to liquidate in 1931. So what you've got here is a lot of strikes, a lot of people who say, look, my family and I need a better life, and so we're going to strike. But essentially, it kind of backfired on them. I'm going to say that the worst fire in Northampton was not in a building. It was the Roberts Meadows. Twice acreage was eliminated in Roberts Meadows in the 1920s, and it was a severe, severe fire. Health and hospitals. Well, there was a spa here. In 1921, there was a sulfur vapor bath, which opened in 1921. A UMass professor decided to retire, and he decided to open up this sulfur vapor baths on the second floor of the Masonic building. Now, the second floor of the Masonic building was the place where Calvin Coolidge had his law offices later on. And it must have really smelled terrible, you know? You know, all these women getting into the sulfur, and then, you know, Gee, soaking in thermal and mineral waters for health goes back to the ancient Egyptians, and Northampton had several water cure establishments in the 1800s. Hydrotherapy was all the rage here and on Round Hill and in Florence, and on land known as Deniston Place near the Cooley Dickinson Hospital for Dr. Deniston. But this was balneotherapy. Balneo, I love that, sulfur. It was coveted in the 1920s, and especially for diseases of the skin, and the earliest newspaper items on sulfur baths in the Connecticut Valley, though, appeared, guess when? 1843. But we were late. What can I say? We were too busy with hydrotherapy. Cooley Dickinson Hospital had a resurrection when the McCallums gave a nursing building in January of 1920 called the Nurses' Home. It was opened in 1922. The Hospital Aid Association was formed in 1924. An addition was needed in 1927, and they had a huge fundraising campaign. The goal of the fundraising campaign, $400,000. The plans for the campaign was 1927, and it was hugely, hugely successful. Then they added a surgical unit in 1928, and then la pièce de résistance, a new maternity wing in 1928, and that was accomplished by 1930. The Hotel Northampton, incorporated in 1923, they chose the name Hampshire first, but then they changed the title to Hotel Northampton in 1926, and it was ready for occupancy in September of 1926. If you wanted to go bowling in Northampton, you couldn't go until 1923. That's when the Brunswick Bowling Alley came in. The Frank Newell Look Memorial Park. Frank Newell Look was an industrialist in Florence. He dies in 1906. His wife knows that he wanted to give something to the city. You know, in the 19th century and early 20th century, what happened was this: service was primary and also philanthropy. Those were the two things. So if you made it big, you had an obligation to give. So what does she do? She offers her land as a gift to the city, and the voters must approve it, and they did in December of 1926. The logistics of accepting the gift worked out in 1927 between she and the city, and she gives over $500,000 for a park in 1928. And the plans for development are given to the city in 1929, and the dedication is 1930. I had so much fun as a kid there. I swam and I ran and I had such a great time. Thank you, Mrs. Luke. Child's Park. The garden house was built in 1922, but then a whole raft of trees, probably elm trees, were killed by pests. But that didn't deter Child's Park. They planted a brand new garden, which featured tulips in 1926. And a whole group of rare trees were planted in 1928. Anybody know what the horn beech is? I've never seen it. But there are horn beeches in Child's Park still. And they dedicated their elms in 1933, but poor Child's Park, you know, we had the Dutch elm disease, and that took care of that. If you were a kid, you went to Beckman's for candy. And Astman, your father went to Astman for his suits. Ann August wasn't established until the 1930s, but there was Berger's Specialty Shop. Anybody remember it? I don't. And then the Brass Knocker Coffee Shop opens in 1928. All these coffee shops and tea rooms, you know, the Rose Tree Inn, Madame de Nozier, you know. And by the way, she defended the Smith students because she said they should smoke. But she was a brilliant woman, and we have to forgive her for that. Bridgman and Lyman Bookstore had been in business on Shop Road for 130 years in 1927. And Butler and Ullman opens new greenhouses in Hadley in 1926. Roads, Route 10, Easthampton, Southampton. Did I get this right? Oh well, you won't mind. I'm just going to be ending pretty soon anyway. They named it the College Highway. Why did they name it the College Highway? Because that's where all the Yaleys came, you know, up from New Haven to visit the Smith girls. And they visited them at the Draper Hotel. That was the place that you went. The Draper had a restaurant, it had beautiful rooms, and of course, if you wanted something sumptuous for your parents, you had them stay at the Draper. Public schools, Bay State School. Now, Bay State, the name Bay State, by the way, comes from the Bay State Tool Company, which was there in the 19th century. Everybody says, why is it Bay State? That's why. All of the factory workers were known as Bay Staters. But they had a lot of kids by 1921. There were an awful lot of factory workers in Bay State. So they built a new school. In 1921, they decided on it, but it was postponed because they didn't have enough money in 1922. Then they asked for more plans in 1925. The project is rejected in 1928, but there's a new building favored in 1929, and they accept the plans. The old building is raised, and they accept the plans. Public inspection of the new building is 1929, and everyone is happy. Holly Grammar goes up about the same time. Bus lines come in. The trolley goes out, bus lines come in. And they come about 1924, and they just decimate, literally decimate trolleys by 1933. All gone. Tracks are up, everything. In Florence, Annunciation School is built in 1925, and several other school buildings go up. I'm not going to say anything about Bridge Street School because this is their celebration year, and I'm going to let them tell the story to you. Streets, Awaga Avenue in Route 66. There was a big controversy over a proposed name change. Awaga means the widening of a road. And if you go up that hill, you see that even today. People said, no, we want the Indian name. We want the Native American name. We're keeping it. Bless their hearts. I like that. Awaga, I see it every time I come in from Southampton. Bancroft Road was the new name adopted for something called 3rd Avenue. Barrett Place was accepted as a street in Florence, and by the way, every time you see a name on a street, it means it honors somebody, and in this case, it was Dr. Barrett, who owned all that land, you know, near where now the Blue Bonnet is, my favorite place, you can tell. Well, I'm going to end pretty soon, except I want to say that weather. You think you've had a bad winter. There was a blizzard in 1920 on February 5th and 6th. Hadley didn't dig out of that until February 19th of 1920. Yes, yes. There was another blizzard following that, March of 1920. A severe wind and rain storm, 1920, and another blizzard, 1921. Severe thunderstorm, which really took down trees, in August of 1921. A terrible sleet and ice storm, 1921. Blizzard, again, 1922. Snowstorm, big one, 1922. Another blizzard in 1923. See, we went through nothing this year. High winds in 1923, violent thunderstorms, gales in 1925, severe gale in 1928. I don't know what the difference is between a gale and a severe gale. Somebody could probably tell me. A destructive thunderstorm in 1929, and we were damaged by hail in 1931. And I'm not going to go into the floods because that is going to be the province of Dylan Gaffney, who's going to show us a very interesting film about one of the worst floods we've ever had here in 1936. But I do want to mention one other person. And Jason, are you here? Could you come up, please? He's dressed like a Yaley. I had him dressed like a Yaley. There was a young man in Northampton in the 1920s named Conrad Thibault. He sang in church choirs. He sang at the high school. and he was probably the most popular baritone of the heyday of radio. He went to New York City. He sang for the opera there, for the Met and the Grand Opera in Europe. And he sang on such network programs as Showboat and the RCA Victor Show. Mr. Tebow was a graduate of Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia and the Juilliard School. And he also performed later on in his life on television. He sang at the inauguration of President Eisenhower and performed at several White House functions later on. In the 1970s, Mr. Tebow taught voice at Manhattan School of Music and at Palm Beach Atlantic College in Palm Beach, Florida. Mr. Tebow was a native of Northampton. He grew up in Northampton, and he, as I said, he sang in a church choir, and his voice was admired by one of the town's residents, Calvin Coolidge, who encouraged him to apply for a scholarship at the Curtis Institute. And Mr. Tebow's coach and mentor was Emilia de Gargaza, the well-known baritone, and also Gargaza was an artist, and he lived for a time here in Northampton. Tebow began his singing career with the Philadelphia Grand Opera. He only had one son, had a wonderful marriage, and he sang all his life. Now, in 1924, when my parents were courting, they were, well, my father fell madly in love with her in Easthampton, at the top of the Easthampton Town Hall. They had dances there. But they would sit, now look, we call them porches, but in those days it was a piazza. Sit on the piazza and sing. And this is a song that my parents taught me, and I hope I can remember all the words. So you're gonna go for it. Why did I kiss that girl? Why, oh why, oh why? Why did I kiss that girl? I could almost cry. I'm nervous, so nervous, I'm worried and blue. And if her kiss did that, what would her hugging do? Ma says that I'm a wreck, I admit she's right. Pa says he'll break my neck, he can't sleep at night. They're upset and all because I ain't like I used to was. Why did I kiss that girl? Why, oh, why, oh, why?
That was a surprise to me, and what a delightful surprise. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. We have even more. Tonight I'm now going to invite Dylan Gaffney, who is also a member of our information services team here at the Forbes Library. He was born and raised in Northampton. His family has lived here for several generations. He is a member of the Northampton Historical Commission and a fountain of knowledge about local history. He conducts photo research for patrons as well as posts fabulous historic images on the library's Facebook page. I hope you're a fan of the library's Facebook page. If not, you should check it out. He's an avid birder, sports fan, and you may recognize him from his outstanding performances from the Forbes Library videos that he stars in. The director of that video is also the talented musician Jason Vazada. So thank you, Jason. Please join me in welcoming Dylan Gaffney.
All right, hard to top that. We do have one more surprise for you tonight. Over a year ago, a friend of mine approached me after seeing our Facebook historical photos, and he said his family would like to make a donation to the archives here at Forbes, and they had something pretty special. So his great-grandfather was Aubrey Butler of Butler and Ullman Florists, who were a Northampton institution downtown across from the Academy of Music from 1913 to 1980, their greenhouses ran. Their greenhouses were both in Hadley and on the land that's currently the YMCA between Massasoit, Woodlawn, and Prospect. In addition to his business, he was involved in nearly all of the civic organizations in Northampton. He was a trustee of the Dickinson Hospital, of Look Park, of the Nonotuck Savings Bank, a director of the Northampton Historical Society, the Society of American Florists, the Porter Phelps Huntington House, and the Northampton Community Chest. He was a commander of the Northampton Commandery. He once noted when accepting a trusteeship on the Look Park board that he was most pleased at this appointment because this happily was the one job he held in which he would not have to raise any money. So somehow, in addition to all of this, he found the time to be a 16mm film enthusiast, and he shot reels and reels of footage in the 1930s. The family was kind enough to share a few of those with us. They'd like to share more if we're interested. So the footage we're going to show you tonight, donated by his family, is of the flood of 1936. It is, as far as we know, the only film footage of Northampton in the flood of 1936 and has never been before seen publicly. The Great New England Flood of 1936 was devastating to Northampton. It came after a winter not unlike the one we just had. Tremendous precipitation, sustained periods of cold, but was followed by an unseasonably warm March and a period of heavy rains which lasted for 2 weeks. By March 12th, the rivers had reached 12 feet above flood stage, and by the 15th, tourists and sightseers had begun to arrive to see its effects. By the 17th of March, a 15-foot-high ice dam had formed at the Mount Tom crossing, and by the 18th, the federal government mobilized the National Guard, and the WPA began to hire thousands of workers to shovel and plow mud from homes and streets, to make clothing to house those displaced from homes, and to rebuild. It's estimated the total cost to the area in damages would equal $3 billion in today's money. So we were able to have the original films donated and converted this March, and we actually received them almost 79 years to the day they were shot. Jason Mazzata and I have edited together 2 of the reels, added some period-appropriate music for you to watch tonight. It begins by the old Connecticut River bridges, takes you down Bridge Street, past the fairgrounds, Williams Street, Market Street, Strong Avenue, and then finishes in the old Mill River bed down on Old South Street. It's only a few minutes long, but I hope you enjoy it. Enjoy the flood.
suggestion that grew to haunt my mind was that eternal question, true love is hard to find. And then the day I found you, my love I had to share. I built my dreams around you, somehow you made me care. I can't forget the night I met you, that's all I'm thinking of. And now you call it madness, but I call it love. You made a promise to be faithful by all the stars above. And now you call it madness, I still call it love. My heart is beating, it keeps repeating for you constantly. You're all I'm needing, and so I'm pleading, please come back to me. You made a plaything out of romance. What do you know of love? That's why you call it madness, but I call it love.
Quite amazing. The resources here at the library are just wonderful. It's a privilege to work here.